The gate agent didn't flinch when she reprinted the boarding pass. "Apologies, Mr. Cole. There's been a seating error. You've been moved to 27B. Darius Cole looked down at the new slip in his hand. Business class to economy. Just like that. No explanation, no courtesy, just protocol. As he walked down the jet bridge, a young white executive strutted past him toward the seat that once bore his name. In row 4B, the flight attendant smiled warmly and helped the man with his carry-on. Not a single crew member questioned the switch. Not one looked twice. To them, it was just a black man being placed where they thought he belonged. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the man they just bumped to coach wasn't just another passenger. He was Darius Cole, billionaire founder of ColTech, architect of the most powerful AI justice system in the country, and the man about to dismantle their careers, their airline, and the silent system of bias they thought would go unnoticed. If you believe in justice, hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories that expose the truth. Darius didn't argue. He tucked the reprinted boarding pass into his blazer pocket and gave a polite nod. The gate agent, whose name tag read Mara Jennings, didn't meet his eyes. She was already calling the next group of passengers forward, her voice clipped, efficient, indifferent. It was the tone of someone who had done this before and expected no consequences. Inside the aircraft, the hum of the cabin seemed louder than usual. Leather creaked under business class passengers settling, and the clink of glasses echoed from the galley, and flight attendants moved like dancers in a routine they knew by heart. Darius glanced toward his original seat, 4B, now occupied by a smug-looking man in a $5,000 suit, laughing into his phone, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. The man didn't even look his way. Darius continued walking. Past the rows of comfort, past the flight attendants, who averted their gazes past the curtain that always symbolized more than just a class divide. His assigned seat, 27B, sat squeezed between a crying baby and a man twice his size. The air back here smelled different, less filtered, less respectful. He sat down slowly, placing his messenger bag beneath the seat in front of him. The woman with the infant gave him an apologetic smile. "Sorry," she whispered, jostling her diaper bag as the baby kicked. Darius smiled gently. "It's all right. We were all new to flying once." As the flight prepared for takeoff, the baby's cries grew louder. Across the aisle, a flight attendant rolled her eyes and walked past them. She hadn't offered help or even water. Darius noticed but said nothing. He pulled out a small leather notebook and a pen. On the outside, he looked calm. On the inside, he was already cataloging, noting names, faces, behaviors. He wasn't angry, he was meticulous. When the flight attendant came by for drink service, she skipped his row entirely. No eye contact, no menu, just silence. In business class, the man now in 4B raised a glass of Glenfiddich, toasting no one in particular. He waved at a crew member who responded instantly. They shared a laugh that rang louder than necessary, louder than appropriate. Darius leaned back in his seat, ignoring the discomfort. The man next to him pulled out a bag of chips and began crunching loudly. Darius remained quiet, observing, recording. He opened his phone and sent a single encrypted message, Phase 1 confirmed. From her seat, 5 rows ahead, freelance journalist Janet Rowe watched the entire incident unfold. She had seen Darius being moved, had watched the way the staff tensed around him, the way the other passenger breezed into business class like it was preordained. She didn't recognize Darius yet, but her instincts stirred. She opened her notes app, typed "black man bumped to economy, replaced by white executive. No incident, no resistance. Calm compliance. Must follow up." She locked her phone and kept watching. Back in row 27, the baby began crying again. The mother rocked her gently, trying to avoid the disapproving glances from other passengers. Darius handed the child his watch, letting her fingers fumble with the metallic band. It worked for a moment. The flight attendant passed again. Darius raised his hand. "Excuse me, may I have a cup of water?" She stopped, glared. "I'll get to you when I can, sir." Then she turned and offered a full beverage tray to the passenger across the aisle. That one interaction told him everything. He glanced at her name tag. L. Park. He remembered it. Across the plane, Mara Jennings huddled near the front galley with another senior crew member. Their conversation wasn't loud, but Darius had exceptional hearing, and he had trained himself to listen for the things people didn't want recorded. "Not going to cry about moving a standby," Mara said dismissively. We've got a concade in business today. That name alone outranks half the manifest. Did he say anything the other attendant asked? Not a word, just nodded. You can tell which ones are used to getting moved. They laughed. Darius wrote it down. Used to getting moved. He glanced around the cabin. No one was filming, no one was protesting. Just the usual apathy wrapped in polite silence. He knew this scenario, knew it better than anyone, because he had spent years designing AI systems to detect patterns exactly like this, subtle, cumulative, never explosive, but always corrosive. The injustice wasn't in the yelling, it was in the quiet, the assumptions, the invisible calculations about who mattered. That's why he was here. He hadn't chosen this flight by accident, hadn't allowed himself to be booked under a DOL decoy profile for no reason. The airline's algorithm had made a decision, and now every action was part of a controlled test. What they didn't realize, what they would soon understand, was that Darius Cole wasn't just another quiet passenger. He was the man who built the system that would expose their entire structure from the inside out, and they had just given him exactly the data he needed. Somewhere over the Atlantic, with cabin lights dimmed and passengers lulled into a rhythm of movie screens and murmured conversations, Darius Cole began phase two. He tapped 3 times on the side of his titanium watch. The gesture looked incidental, absent-minded even. But on the server racks at ColTech's secure data center in Zurich, that tap initiated a covert protocol. His phone, which appeared powered off, was in fact cycling through packets of real-time cabin telemetry, seat allocation metrics, and behavior logging, captured by an onboard program his company had once licensed to airlines under the promise of efficiency. That licensing deal had expired 2 years ago, but the code still ran. It had been built by his team. And like all good engineers, they'd embedded a dormant sublayer one, accessible only by cryptographic credentials known to exactly 3 people on Earth. Darius was one of them. He checked the tiny blue progress bar on his watch's display. Passenger interactions 143 logged, staff deviations 11 flagged, racial bias probability 93.2%. He leaned back, let that number settle, then added his own manual annotation. 27B, reassignment premeditated. C boarding log anomaly timestamped 14 minutes before gate close. Across the aisle, the baby was finally asleep. Her mother slumped into the seat exhausted. Darius passed her the rolled blanket from his lap without a word. That was power too quiet, sustaining power. In business class, Edward Consincate chuckled into his drink. His second, or was it third scotch, now low in the crystal glass. People need to understand lanes, he slurred to his neighbor, a woman too polite to object. Some belong in the front, some don't. Darius could hear it all. The crew wasn't intervening, and they wouldn't. Not when the offender's father was one of the airline's largest institutional investors. Darius closed his eyes for just a moment, visualizing the layout of the flight manifest on his retinal display. He watched names shift and flash. Relationships connect like constellations, travel history, loyalty tiers, ethnic origin probabilities. The algorithm didn't lie. That was the thing about code. It reflected the biases of those who built it. It had taken him years to accept that even his own systems intended to be neutral weren't. And that realization had shifted everything. He hadn't just set out to build better algorithms. He'd set out to build ethical ones. Technology that didn't just mirror injustice but identified it, flagged it, prevented it. It was why he turned down a $600 million buyout from Meridian Global. Why he was now the target of their sabotage. And why his being bumped to 27B wasn't a coincidence, it was bait. They'd taken it. His assistant, Taylor, messaged with an update. Facial recon confirms Edward's call logs. Live intercept in progress. Janet Rowe is posting. Janet. Darius turned his head slightly and caught sight of her glowing screen 5 rows up. Her fingers danced across the keys. She hadn't introduced herself yet, but he knew her work. Investigative pieces that didn't scream but seared. She didn't just report injustice. She documented it, layered it, mapped it. She would be the one to show this wasn't just a seating mistake, it was a system playing out exactly as modeled. Meanwhile, Linda Park poured coffee in the galley. Her hands shook. She wasn't sure if anyone noticed, but Darius had. She had seen too much, heard too much, and yet still followed orders that twisted her stomach. Guilt had a pattern. It was detectable. As she turned back down the aisle, she paused briefly beside him. "Tomato juice again?" she asked softly. "Yes, thank you." She handed it to him and added quietly, "I looked up your name." He sipped slowly. "And you're not on the manifest as who you are. But I remember your TED Talk." Their eyes met. He didn't answer. She didn't push. She simply said, "Whatever this is, I want to help." He nodded once, then keep your eyes open. What happens next matters. Linda moved on a bit straighter this time. Janet, meanwhile, was tagging posts, business class bias, seating, games invisible lines. Within minutes, replies were pouring in, people from around the world sharing eerily similar stories. The data was becoming human. And when that happened, change became inevitable. Darius opened a secure thread and typed, "Confirm we are go for Geneva delay. Cross-link this flight to MJ surveillance audit. Match Linda Park's case. Begin payload assembly." In a surveillance room 5,000 miles away, analysts snapped into motion. This wasn't just about a bumped seat anymore. This was about the system behind the seat, the pattern behind the faces, the culture that told Edward Consincade he was entitled and told Darius Cole he was expendable. Tonight, that system would be exposed. And it all began with a seat swap nobody thought twice about, except him. Mara Jennings sipped her coffee in the forward galley, oblivious to the seismic cracks forming beneath the smooth surface of the flight. Her tablet displayed cabin stats and beverage logs, but none of it showed what was truly unraveling, because what was breaking wasn't in the data, but in the assumptions the data had been built to protect. She reviewed the seating manifest for a third time, eyes skimming over Edward Consincade's reassignment. Everything looked official, no alerts. No documentation of the manipulated overrides she had executed minutes before boarding. Mara prided herself on cleaning up after herself, but her system didn't know Darius Cole had built the software, and that every digital footprint she thought she had wiped was in fact preserved in a blockchain audit log outside her reach. She smirked to herself, still convinced she'd done the airline a favor. Keeping a Consincade happy was good business. And if one anonymous black man had to be moved, well, that's just how the world worked. Except this time, the man wasn't anonymous. Back in 27B, Darius reread the flag logs from his team. The system had assigned him a business class seat confirmed. It had then been overridden by a manual code, MJ override 4B to 27B, timestamped 3:06 p.m. The initials weren't subtle. Across the aisle, Linda Park felt her stomach turn as she reviewed the digital copy of the seating logs Darius had forwarded her moments ago. She could see Mara's override. It was there in black and white. And suddenly everything Linda had rationalized over her short career, the subtle differentials in tone, the repeated reassignment of black passengers, the unspoken priorities came into horrifying focus. It wasn't a series of coincidences, it was policy masked as discretion. And worse, it was automated. She knew what that meant. If the overrides were being executed manually and learned by the system, then the bias wasn't just tolerated, it was being normalized. Across the cabin, Janet Rose scrolled through her incoming tips. Her post had gone viral. Within an hour, her inbox was overflowing with messages, current and former employees of the airline, sharing stories of discriminatory practices, screenshots of internal training documents, even covert recordings of supervisors giving directives that echoed Mara's tone exactly. Her phone buzzed again. Anonymous staffer check, protocol read, internal doc for premium cabin priority. It's not written, but everyone knows. You can bump non-elites as needed, especially if they're likely to cause friction. Read POC. Search tag, expected passenger profile, BIFOC. You'll see it. Janet's pulse quickened. This wasn't an isolated case, it was systemic rot. Back in the galley, Mara continued casually chatting with Rick, bragging about how smooth the boarding process had been. You saw how quick he complied. No argument. That's the kind you want. Quiet, obedient. She chuckled. Didn't even ask for a receipt. Rick raised an eyebrow. You sure about that? Someone like that doesn't just take a middle seat without reason. He looked too composed. He didn't even react. Mara scoffed. He knows where he belongs. Unbeknownst to her, Linda had left her phone face down and recording on the counter behind the coffee pot. Every word was being logged to a secure server. The phrase "he knows where he belongs" would echo through newsrooms and courtrooms before the week was out. But the rot went deeper. In the cockpit, Captain William Reynolds reviewed weather patterns and flight paths. He barely registered the email pinging his screen. Priority alert passenger downgrade report, all flagged, not by a human, but by an anomaly detector embedded in the airline's own feedback system. The tool had been installed after a civil rights audit 3 years ago. Management had promised it would help catch unconscious bias. In practice, they disabled alerts on most flights. But Darius had hard-coded a backup trigger just in case. The report now sat blinking on the captain's screen. But he didn't read it. He deleted it. Too much trouble. Darius from 27B saw the deletion live on his private feed. That was the moment he knew. This wasn't just about Edward or Mara. The system itself was complicit. It trained its own staff on discretion, rewarded pattern matching over empathy, and buried accountability under layers of plausible deniability. Airline AI had become a mirror of its creators, selective, cynical, biased. Darius typed 3 words into his secure thread, begin data trap. Across the Atlantic, ColTech's engineers activated a data snare intercepting every internal crew message, every seat reassignment, every cabin note logged under the vague category of passenger behavior. Linda glanced down at her smartwatch. The alert flashed collection in progress. She looked up, straightened her blazer, and stepped back into the cabin. If the system was this broken, she wasn't going to stay silent anymore. Not tonight. Not ever again. Janet Rowe's fingers hovered over her keyboard, then resumed typing in rapid bursts. The narrative was writing itself, but this wasn't just a story. It was an exposure. Her journalist's instincts screamed that she'd uncovered something far more damning than a seating mishap. She had all the signs of evasive crew behavior, passive compliance from passengers too, used to being dismissed a suspiciously quiet man whose calm felt more like strategy than submission. She glanced at Darius again, still seated, still unreadable. Most passengers saw a man reading in a cramped middle seat. Janet saw something else. Someone watching. Someone waiting. Her email pinged. Another tip. Former flight supervisor anonymous check. Flights from last quarter, over 70% of seat downgrades due to operational necessity affected black or brown passengers. We were told not to write down race, but everyone knew. Janet added it to her folder. The pattern was undeniable. She'd seen enough to recognize an institutional disease masked as logistical friction. Linda Park, meanwhile, had returned to the front galley. Her chest tightened as she passed Mara, who barked orders with the confidence of someone who believed she was untouchable. Remember to smile more, Mara quipped without looking up. Passenger 27B keeps glancing around. Don't let him feel like he can complain about service too. Linda didn't answer. She just kept walking, but something inside her had shifted. She passed the coffee pot where her phone still recorded. She hadn't planned to become a whistleblower, but the lies piling around her were getting too loud to ignore. And now she wasn't just seeing the bias, she was documenting it. Darius met her eyes briefly as she moved through the cabin. There was a flicker of mutual recognition. Not just that they both knew something was wrong, but that they both intended to do something about it. From her seat, Janet whispered a voice memo to herself, documenting coordinated crew behavior. Disparity in tone. Disparity in service. Repeated patterns match whistleblower data. Subject in 27B remains composed, likely strategic observer. Probability rising that this is a planned exposure, not an isolated event. Back in business class, Edward Consincade knocked back another scotch and laughed loudly about a deal he'd just sabotaged at a rival firm. He had no idea he was speaking within earshot of Janet's phone microphone, no clue that his voice would be featured in a viral montage the next morning. But the rot didn't just live in his arrogance. It fed off the silence of everyone who'd normalized it. 2 rows behind a black couple exchanged glances as the flight attendant passed them a cold meal without comment. They had both noticed the warm greetings reserved for white passengers, the "of course, Sir S" and the "how may I assist you, ma'ams?" Neither of them said a word. They'd been here before. You learned to smile, to not make waves, but this time something was different. Janet stood and approached them quietly. "May I ask if you had any issues during boarding or with seating?" she asked in a hushed tone. The husband looked unsure. The wife spoke first. "We reserved these seats months ago. Paid extra for comfort plus. Got reassigned at the gate. They said it was a system error." Janet nodded. "Did they offer compensation?" "No," the man answered. "Just told us to take it or wait for a later flight." Janet made a note. Then another ping, this time from a different flight attendant, texting anonymously through a burner email she'd set up. Flight attendant, 6 years experience. Unwritten rule: when space is tight, move the least likely to escalate. It's a euphemism. Everyone knows what it means. Darius Cole being in coach, that's no accident. Janet looked up sharply. She reread the name. Darius Cole. Her eyes darted back to 27B. She grabbed her phone and opened her browser. A quick search confirmed it. Tech billionaire, AI ethics advocate, CEO of ColTech, sitting in coach, silently observing everything. She inhaled slowly. Her hunch had been right. This wasn't just a story, it was a setup. She stood and walked toward the rear galley where Linda stood pretending to sort meal trays. Janet held up her phone without a word. Linda glanced down. Darius Cole, identified as passenger in seat 27B, industry shakeup likely imminent. The two women shared a long look, and alliance silently formed. Both had seen enough, and now they understood why. In 27B, Darius clicked send on a single message. Phase 2 confirmed. First witnesses awakened. The dominoes had started falling, and this time they wouldn't stop. The curtain had been pulled back, but the real show was just beginning. Darius Cole sat motionless in 27B, a model of quiet patience. To the untrained eye, he was just a well-dressed black man, inconvenienced by airline logistics. But behind his stillness, the gears were turning. Data was being collected, algorithms were updating, patterns were solidifying, and witnesses were waking up. Janet Rowe returned to her seat and immediately opened a secure file on her tablet, a program she used for high-stakes investigative work. It timestamped events, categorized incidents by type, and cross-referenced with her growing archive of passenger complaints. Already, she'd logged 6 separate instances of disparate treatment by the crew, and she was just getting started. She discreetly activated the audio recorder built into her glasses. Her lens glinted briefly in the dim cabin light as she turned toward the front. 2 rows up, Mara Jennings huddled with Rick Thompson by the beverage cart. They weren't whispering. They didn't need to. They assumed no one was listening. Cole didn't make a fuss, Rick said with a smirk. Just gathered his things and went back. Smart. Knows his place. Mara rolled her eyes. Doesn't matter how polite they are. Still think the algorithm was too generous putting him up front. Should have been flagged at check-in. Janet's blood chilled. They had expected the system to target him. She didn't need more confirmation, but it was piling up. She typed a brief note into her file. Crew normalizes algorithmic sorting as policy. Perception of who belongs is institutional. Meanwhile, Linda Park retrieved a service tablet from the charging dock in the galley. Her fingers trembled slightly as she navigated through the onboard messaging logs. Crew-to-crew chats weren't encrypted. They weren't even monitored unless flagged. She scrolled. Mara moved 27B. Back if Concade shows up. We need him happy. Rick copy. Looks like another DOL profile. Standard swap. Linda's eyes widened. DOL profile. She remembered now. That was the code they used for passengers deemed disruptive only if loud. Translation: blackmail likely professional, but statistically unlikely to escalate. She took a screenshot and saved it to a hidden folder on her phone. At that moment, Janet quietly approached from the aisle and held up a slip of paper. 2 things she whispered. First, your logs just confirmed something. Second, that man in 27B. That's Darius Cole. Linda's heart nearly stopped. She mouthed the words. Oh my God, Janet nodded solemnly, and he knows exactly what's happening. For a moment, Linda stood frozen. Then she pivoted, grabbing a clean napkin and using it as cover to write a short message. I have access to the system. Can document everything. I want to help. Linda. She passed it to Janet, who folded it and tucked it into her sleeve. The next time she walked past Darius, she'd drop it discreetly into his lap. No eye contact, no acknowledgement. The operation had shifted. They were no longer reacting to injustice. They were documenting it brick by brick. In 27B, Darius felt the weight of the napkin land gently in his lap. He opened it beneath the tray table. A small smile formed at the corner of his mouth. Confirmation. Internal ally activated. He tapped his watch twice. The gesture activated a secondary encrypted channel to ColTech's headquarters. Within seconds, Taylor responded. Taylor, Linda Park confirmed. Cross-checking name with prior case file, J7745. High correlation. Proceed. Darius typed one word, proceed. Back in the front of the cabin, Edward Kincaid laughed obnoxiously again, loud enough for multiple passengers to grimace. My dad built this airline's international portfolio, he declared. This seat is basically mine by birthright. His arrogance unchecked was now becoming the most damning evidence of all. Janet, 2 rows behind him, captured every word with crystal clarity. Then something unexpected happened. A white man in his late 50s, seated nearby, turned slightly in his seat and said, "You know, I think you just embarrassed yourself." The cabin went quiet. Edward blinked, confused. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," the man replied calmly. "The guy you displaced was sitting there before you walked up, flashing entitlement like a VIP badge. Maybe take your scotch and your lineage down a notch." Several nearby passengers nodded quietly. Edward scowled and turned away. Janet's fingers flew over her tablet. The public was starting to awaken, not just the marginalized passengers, but the ones conditioned to stay silent. Darius watched it all unfold, eyes narrowed in quiet calculation. He typed again to tailor awareness spreading. Begin Phase 2B, extract all real-time crew communications. Include biometric emotional readouts if available. She responded instantly. Already running. Linda, meanwhile, had returned to the forward galley, her posture straighter, now her steps more purposeful. She no longer flinched when Mara barked orders. Her silence wasn't submission, it was strategy. As turbulence rippled through the cabin, the seatbelt signs flicked on. Darius fastened his belt slowly, deliberately. Every moment, every movement was being archived, and soon the whole world would see. Darius Cole had always known the power of silence. The world underestimated quiet men, but silence when intentional was strategy, and this strategy was unfolding perfectly. By the time the seatbelt sign blinked off, Linda Park had downloaded over a dozen internal crew messages containing not only discriminatory codes but explicit exchanges about passenger appearance. The crew's language wasn't overtly racist, it was smarter than that, wrapped in professionalism, delivered in policy speak, but the subtext was unmistakable. She opened a secure folder on her personal device and began compiling the log files. Each screenshot was time-stamped and paired with her own brief observations. She added a header to the document, "Inconsistency in Service Observational Bias." Meanwhile, Janet Rowe remained in observation mode. A career in journalism had taught her that the most damning indictments were rarely shouted. They were embedded in posture phrasing, eye contact, or the lack thereof. She documented how Darius had been asked to move seats with a clipped tone, how Mara had addressed Edward with deferential warmth. The contrast was now data. Her notes were ready to evolve into a formal exposé. She typed the title, "Privilege in Motion, a Business Class Case Study." A few rows up, Dr. Edward Kincaid continued sipping scotch as if nothing around him mattered. But his fingers betrayed him. Rapid tapping on his phone hushed calls with Meridian's legal advisors, increasingly frantic commands to his assistant. "Find out who that man is. Get a confirmation." "I think we're in trouble," he muttered. Too late. Darius tapped his watch once more. His satellite connection remained encrypted, invisible to in-flight Wi-Fi. Taylor's face appeared on the narrow watch screen in a grainy video feed. "He's panicking," she said flatly. "Good," Darius replied. "Begin the ping relay. I want Edward's outbound comms rerouted. Anything he tries to do now needs to echo back to us." "You're asking for a full interception," Taylor said. "Not just tracking. You want to mirror his entire flow." "Yes, that's the move." He paused, then added, "And Taylor informed Geneva, we're pushing the ColTech press conference forward." "Understood." Press embargo lifted. "Not yet," Darius said. "Wait until touchdown." In the galley, Linda made her boldest move yet. She stepped around Mara under the pretense of assisting with meal prep and glanced at the central crew terminal. It displayed a summary of all flagged passengers for the flight coded in shorthand used only by internal airline operations. Linda tapped into the system and searched the flight manifest for Darius Cole's current status. Still listed as DOL disruptive, only if loud. Her blood boiled. She changed it. She deleted the DOL tag and updated the notes section. Passenger was reassigned under questionable conditions. Recommend immediate review by ethics department. Then without hesitation, she opened the secure cloud folder shared by Janet and uploaded a screenshot of her action. She turned heart-pounding to find Mara watching her. The supervisor's eyes narrowed. "What are you doing?" "Correcting a tag," Linda replied calmly. "It was inaccurate." Mara stepped closer. "You don't touch classifications without supervisor approval." Linda didn't flinch. "And supervisors don't alter seating without cause." A standoff. For a moment, neither woman moved. Then Mara leaned in, her voice low. "Be careful, Park. This industry doesn't forgive disloyalty." Linda's jaw set. Maybe it's time it did. Back in 27B, Darius was reading the message that Linda had just sent through their shared encrypted thread. "Classification removed. Upload confirmed. You were never DOL to me." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile only someone with a decades-long plan could afford. A soft buzz ticked on his watch again. Taylor FAA monitor loop is in place. Facial match confirmed for Mara, Rick, and Edward. Their prior infractions logged. "We now have a chain." "Excellent," Darius replied. "Upload to internal council only for now. Prepare full merge before landing." He turned toward the elderly woman beside him, still struggling to adjust her blanket. He gently helped lifting the edge and tucking it in. "You're very kind," she whispered. "I was raised that way," he said softly. "Kindness shouldn't be rare." Rose ahead. Janet Rowe had begun syncing her notes to an external server. She captured Mara's tone with Linda Edwards' dismissive scorn and Rick's knows his place comment. The pattern was clear now. Her draft's central thesis had shifted. It was no longer about a black man being removed from business class. It was about how an entire industry had been trained to look past certain people and how that training was starting to crack. She opened a new section of her report, witness testimonies, cross-racial observations. And then she noticed something strange. A younger white passenger, perhaps in his 20s, was scrolling through social media on his phone. His face had gone pale. Janet leaned forward. "Is everything okay?" He looked up. "You're Janet Rowe, right?" She nodded. "People are already talking about this flight." Janet blinked. "What do you mean?" He handed her his phone. A tweet was trending with a blurry photo taken from near the galley. It showed Darius helping the elderly woman with her blanket. The caption read, "Guy got booted from business class for no reason. Still helping people. Not sure what happened, but something smells wrong." Thousands of likes, hundreds of retweets, and growing. Janet grinned. "Perfect, and it." This wasn't just data anymore. It was narrative. Strategic moves had been made, and the world was starting to notice. "Ban kamuan viet tip fan tip teo hong forno. Ban danai yes, ChatGPT danai partain." Direct confrontation, exactly 850 words. The seatbelt sign chimed as the aircraft began its initial descent into JFK. Cabin lights flickered gently, casting a dim glow over the cabin. But the quiet ambiance did little to calm the rising tension. Something invisible, electric, hummed in the air, an undercurrent of reckoning that had followed every passenger down from 30,000 feet. Mara Jennings was pacing near the galley now, her once confident stride reduced to nervous fidgeting. She had seen Linda whispering to Darius, seen Janet exchanging glances with other passengers. Her instincts told her something was building, but she didn't yet understand what. She was about to find out. At 15,000 feet, a subtle ping reached Darius's watch. Taylor's voice filtered through in a calm, encrypted message. "Phase 1 complete. FAA and legal counsel are standing by at the gate. EEOC reps confirmed. We've secured terminal access. Ready for your call." Darius didn't reply. Not yet. Instead, he stood. In the small space between rows 27 and 28, he looked to the front of the aircraft. He took a breath, not for nerves, but for impact. Timing mattered. Visibility mattered. And this moment was designed for both. He stepped into the aisle. Passengers turned eyes, tracking the tall black man in the well-cut suit who had been forced to endure the cramped middle seat for the past 7 hours. They hadn't forgotten his quiet grace, his refusal to make a scene. And now they watched, curious, confused, as he began walking not toward the bathroom, but forward, toward business class. Janet raised her phone. Linda paused in mid-drink service, heart catching in her throat. And Edward Consincade, mid-sentence with a fellow executive about a vineyard purchase, looked up and froze. Darius stopped just short of the galley where Mara stood, clipboard in hand. She turned surprised, tightening into a scowl. "Sir, you need to return to your seat," she snapped. "No," Darius said simply. "Excuse me?" He met her eyes. "I said no. I'm not returning to that seat. I'm reclaiming the one that was mine to begin with." Several passengers murmured. Phones came out. Mara strict-gidded. "You were moved due to an overbooking standard airline protocol." "That's a lie," Darius said flatly. "And you know it." He turned slightly, addressing the surrounding passengers. "This morning I was assigned seat 4B, paid, confirmed, checked in with full documentation. And I was removed without cause." A ripple of shock passed through the rows. Darius continued, voice even but unyielding. "I was told there was a booking error, that the seat had to be reassigned. But we all know why I was moved. Because of who I am, or rather because of who you assumed I wasn't." Mara's cheeks flushed, her voice faltering. "This is not the time or place for accusations, sir. It's the exact time," Darius cut in. "Because this plane is a microcosm of hierarchy, of assumption, of systems that tell people like me to sit quietly in the back while others who didn't earn their seat are treated like royalty." He pointed to Edward, who had risen now indignant. "This man who arrived late, who had no business class ticket, was elevated, while I was demoted." Edward scoffed. "You have no idea who I am." "I do," Darius interrupted. "You're Edward Consincade, senior counsel at Meridian Global, and the man whose company has spent the last year trying to dismantle the ethical frameworks that protect vulnerable populations from discriminatory AI." The entire cabin seemed to freeze. Mara blinked, what Darius turned back to her. "You didn't just discriminate against a paying customer today. You discriminated against the founder and CEO of ColTech, whose team flagged this airline 3 months ago for patterns of racial bias in seating upgrades and customer service. And today you proved our data right." Silence. Until Linda stepped forward, holding a tablet in her hand. "She's telling the truth," she said, voice shaking but steady. "I'm a crew member. I accessed the flight log. He was labeled DOL disruptive, only if allowed a tag used internally for passengers flagged on appearance, not behavior." Gasps. Janet stepped into the aisle, phone lifted. "This is being recorded," she said clearly. "Everything, for publication and federal review." Darius looked at Mara, whose expression had crumbled into disbelief. "You thought I was just a man in a suit. You didn't think I had power. But power isn't always loud. Sometimes it listens, watches, waits, then it acts." He tapped his watch. A final command was issued silently. At the front of the plane, the intercom dinged. The captain's voice, unsteady, now crackled overhead. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been asked to hold briefly before docking due to terminal congestion. Please remain seated." But outside, the truth was landing with them. On the tarmac below, black SUVs, press vans, and federal vehicles waited in formation. Because this wasn't just a confrontation. It was the prelude to accountability. The aircraft door opened not to the routine bustle of ground staff, but to a phalanx of waiting authority, FAA officials in Navy windbreakers, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, officers holding binders, and ColTech's legal team flanking the entrance like a tribunal. Cameras flashed the moment the jetway connected. This wasn't a landing, it was an unveiling. Inside the cabin, panic bloomed. Captain Reynolds stepped into the aisle, voice low and tight with irritation. "What the hell is going on?" A woman in a gray pantsuit held up her ID. "FAA oversight. Your flight is now part of a federal civil rights investigation. All crew are to remain on board for debriefing. Passengers will disembark shortly in order." Reynolds glanced at Mara, whose face was pale. "What did you do?" he hissed. But before she could respond, Darius stood. "Captain Reynolds," he said calmly, "my name is Darius Cole, CEO of ColTech. What happened on this flight wasn't just discrimination. It was the real-world confirmation of a pattern our AI had predicted months ago. You, your crew, and your airline just became the focal point of a national reckoning." Reynolds opened his mouth to object, but Linda was already stepping forward, tablet in hand. "I have communication logs," she said. "Internal messages from crew about which passengers to downgrade based on perceived threat level and image." Darius was flagged before he boarded. Janet raised her phone. "That's corroborated by multiple witness statements and in-flight observations. I've already submitted preliminary findings to 3 news outlets. They'll publish within the hour." Crew members exchanged glances, fear, denial, rage. Some looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor. Then came the real shock. From behind, Darius emerged Taylor live and in person, accompanied by ColTech's general counsel. They had boarded quietly through the service entrance while attention was focused on the main jetway. Taylor handed the captain a document. "Here's a summary of our findings," she said crisply. 27 verified cases of in-flight discriminatory treatment logged over the last 6 months on this airline. This flight was our controlled audit. Your behavior today confirmed every statistical anomaly we flagged in your internal performance data. Reynolds stared at the paper as if it might ignite in his hands. "You set us up." "No," Darius replied. "We let you act as you always do. You set yourself up." At the front of the plane, Edward Consincade had finally risen, trying to slip past the unfolding chaos toward the galley door. But he stopped short when he saw the Department of Justice agents waiting at the threshold. "Mr. Consincade," one of them said, "you're being detained under suspicion of antitrust violations and patent manipulation involving the acquisition attempts of ColTech's ethical AI systems." Edward's mouth moved, but no sound came out. Darius turned to him. "You thought you were securing power. What you did was expose a conspiracy. Your arrogance collapsed the firewall between systemic bias and actionable evidence." As Edward was escorted off the plane, Mara snapped, "This is insane." She shouted, voice cracking. "We followed policy. You can't punish us for following protocol." "But that's the problem," Linda said quietly. "The protocol is the problem." Janet nodded. "And now the world knows it." Passengers began to disembark, rows called not just by section, but by coordination. Media cameras waited just outside, flashing as Darius stepped into the jetway flanked by Taylor and Janet. Linda walked just behind him, her face composed, her hands steady. For the first time in her career, she wasn't hiding who she was or what she believed in. Reporters surged forward, microphones extended. "Mr. Cole, is it true you were bumped from business class because of racial bias? Will ColTech be filing a civil lawsuit? Is this a broader indictment of the airline industry?" Darius paused, gaze sweeping across the crowd. "We gathered evidence. We confirmed patterns. Now we begin the process of accountability. Not just for me, but for every passenger treated as invisible." Behind them, crew members were being escorted off separately, some defiantly silent, others in tears. Captain Reynolds tried to speak to the press, but his voice was drowned out by Linda handing over her tablet to FAA investigators. "This contains everything," she said. "Chat logs, cabin crew notes, passenger profile tags. No one can call this anecdotal anymore." Inside the terminal, chaos had erupted. Social media feeds exploded with business class bias. ColTech's press team had already released a side-by-side comparison of the airline's internal training documents with footage from the flight showing exactly how policies translated into discrimination. By the time the CEO of the airline arrived, breathless and surrounded by PR handlers, it was too late. His security badge failed to open the gate. FAA had locked it. Taylor handed him a folder. "We'll be in touch. We suggest your board retains legal counsel." In the flurry of activity, Janet stood with her phone in hand, live streaming the arrival of the final passengers. One older black couple stopped to speak with Darius. "We've flown this airline for 20 years, the man said. "They've always made us feel like we were asking for too much. Today, you gave us permission to say enough." Darius offered his hand. "It's time the system asked more of itself." The collapse had begun not just of a flight crew's authority, but of an entire industry's unchallenged structure of quiet prejudice. What came next would be messy, litigious, revolutionary. But there was no going back. The cabin was empty now, save for the remnants of a disrupted hierarchy crumbled. Policies abandoned authority, and the faint scent of burnt coffee still lingering in the galley. Crew members sat clustered in the front rows, some silent, some whispering desperately to each other. Mara sat apart, hands clenched in her lap, staring at the closed cockpit door like it could offer salvation. Outside, the jetway buzzed with press investigators and airport security. But inside the fuselage, a strange quiet settled, the kind that comes after collapse but before consequence. Linda stood just behind the last row. Her uniform slightly wrinkled, her name tag tilted. She hadn't asked to be part of this. But somewhere between handing Darius a glass of tomato juice and exposing systemic malpractice, she had stopped being a bystander. She wasn't sure what that made her now. A whistleblower, a traitor, or something entirely new. The curtain separating business class from economy hung awkwardly on its track, half open, torn slightly at the seam, a symbol that once had meaning. It meant prestige, access, a barrier for some, a promise for others. Now it just swayed in the stale cabin air, useless. Taylor stepped inside the aircraft, her heels clicking softly on the carpet. She glanced around, taking in the flight crew, the cabin layout, the aftermath. Protocol 12 has concluded, she said. Data confirmed. Response teams are in place. Regulatory officers have moved to formal investigation. Captain Reynolds rubbed his face with both hands. Do you even understand what you've done? Taylor raised an eyebrow. Do you? He stared back at her, the authority drained from his posture. The uniform didn't fit quite the same. Not anymore. Darius entered behind her, no longer just the quietly demoted passenger in row 27B, no longer just the tech billionaire behind ColTech, but a man whose silent witness had detonated the illusion of neutrality that this airline and so many others clung to. He nodded to Taylor, then turned to the crew. You will all have your chance to speak with investigators, he said, voice calm. What you say will determine what happens next. Not just for this airline, but for yourselves. Mara stood abruptly, her voice hoarse. You think you're better than us, that because you have money, you get to tear us down. I think systems don't change unless someone's willing to risk being uncomfortable, Darius said. And you proved our models right, word for word, gesture for gesture. Rick, the first officer who had laughed earlier in the flight, now looked away, shame reddening his face. A soft knock interrupted the moment. A federal agent leaned into the doorway. Ms. Park, he asked. Linda stepped forward. Yes, you've been requested to assist in the testimony review. They'd like to begin with you. She nodded and started toward the exit, but paused at the curtain. She turned, eyes scanning the cabin one last time. It's not just a flight, she said quietly. It's a blueprint for everything we get wrong and everything we could get right if we try. Darius watched her go. A flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, recognition perhaps. That moral clarity when spoken by the once silent is more powerful than any press release. Back in the airport's executive conference room, Janet was reviewing footage captured by her phone and Linda's. A dozen screens lined the wall, one showing the facial recognition logs from the airline's internal system. Another showing the seat downgrade order, time-stamped 5 minutes after Edward Consincade's call to his father. Another showing Mara's candid admission about certain types being flagged. She glanced at the door as Linda entered. You okay? Janet asked. I don't know, Linda said. I think I just left one life and walked into another. Janet gestured to a seat. Welcome to it. The room filled gradually with regulators, legal counsel, media liaisons. And one by one, the walls of corporate denial began to peel. The CEO of the airline, pale and sweating, entered last. He wasn't prepared for the number of federal jackets in the room, nor for the look on Taylor's face when she handed him a printed copy of the seat reallocation model, overlaid with the airline's own customer complaint data. The correlation, unmistakable. This is, he began. The truth, Taylor finished. And your chance to decide how much worse it gets. Mara was brought in next, not with the same venom as Edward, but not with leniency either. She glanced at Linda, eyes flickering with something between anger and fear. Linda met her gaze with something steadier. Not triumph, not revenge, just clarity. Janet stood and addressed the room. Before today, we thought these stories were isolated. Now we have a map, not just of this flight, but of an entire industry's quiet patterns. Darius took the floor last. He didn't need slides. His presence was the evidence. This wasn't about revenge, he said. It was about visibility, about systems designed in shadows. Today we dragged one into the light. He turned toward the window where the sun had begun to set over the tarmac. What we do next decides whether this moment becomes a headline or a turning point. The room fell into a heavy, reflective silence. For the first time, there were no rankings, no class separations, no barriers made of curtain or assumption. Just people, some complicit, some courageous, sitting together, breathing the same air and realizing the line between passenger and witness had forever been blurred. The next morning, the headlines arrived like thunder. Business class bias airline crew suspended in widening federal investigation. ColTech CEO secretly tests airline systemic discrimination exposed. FAA launches industry-wide audit following viral mid-flight incident. Across boardrooms in Manhattan, San Francisco, and Washington, executives who once dismissed DEI trainings as corporate decor began calling emergency meetings. Some contacted crisis consultants. Others reached out to PR firms. But it was too late for spin. The story had outpaced their narratives. In a sleek downtown office in D.C., Regina Barnes of the FAA sat across from the Department of Transportation's Deputy Secretary, both scanning the compiled preliminary findings from Darius Cole's team. They didn't speak for several minutes. Each line of algorithmic evidence landed like a gavel. 78% correlation between downgrades and passenger racial identity, the deputy finally said, setting down his pen. And 86% of those reassignments occurred when a white VIP requested an upgrade, Regina added. This isn't just implicit bias, it's operational policy cloaked in plausible deniability. By noon, 3 major carriers were subpoenaed for their upgrade and seating algorithms. And by 3 p.m., the airline involved in Darius's flight had suspended 10 executives, including Mara Jennings, Rick Thompson, and Captain Reynolds. Their internal statements, previously hidden under legalese and performance reviews, were leaked anonymously. Mara's evaluations showed consistent complaints from both passengers and junior crew about her tone, her selective enforcement, and her unwillingness to engage diverse customers without escalation. In one internal memo from 6 months prior, a junior HR officer had flagged a pattern in upgrade decisions across 10 routes. It was ignored. Now that same officer received an offer to join the new FAA oversight unit being formed under the Inclusive Mobility Act, a bill fast-tracked through Congress after public pressure exploded. Meanwhile, at ColTech's Manhattan headquarters, Taylor monitored legal responses from 32 companies implicated in the broader web of algorithmic discrimination. The press release they'd launched the day before had gone nuclear. 3 law firms offered class action representation within hours, and 5 corporate boards requested meetings with Darius to discuss strategic partnerships for ethical tech compliance, a coded way of saying, "Help us before we're next." Darius read their requests in silence. Then he slid them into a drawer without a word. Across from him sat Linda Park, freshly transitioned from her uniform into a sharp charcoal suit. Her badge now read Director of Ethics and Accountability, ColTech. Her voice was steadier than it had been on the plane. "I just got off a call with Marcus's attorney. The judge has agreed to reopen his case. They're calling it a landmark instance of algorithmic misconduct." Darius nodded, but his gaze was distant. Linda leaned forward. "It's working, I know," he said, then exhaled. "I just wonder how many other Marcuses are still out there waiting in systems that haven't been exposed yet." Linda looked toward the windows. Outside, digital billboards scrolled with coverage of the airline incident. One displayed a quote from Darius's press conference, "The invisible must be made visible." The streets below were filled with conversations on phones and coffee shops between strangers. Stories were emerging. "I filed a complaint 2 years ago," wrote a corporate traveler from Texas in a now viral tweet. "Told the airline I'd been downgraded for no reason. They said it was a system error. Now I see the pattern. My mom always told me not to make a fuss when they move us to coach," another user posted. "She said, pick your battles. Turns out we should have picked this one." The dam had broken. People weren't just angry. They were connecting the dots, and connecting too with each other. In Geneva, the International Aviation Association called an emergency session to revise bias oversight protocols. Several European carriers asked for access to ColTech's audit tools. Darius agreed, but only on one condition: full transparency. Back in New York, Janet Rowe was preparing for her most anticipated interview, yet a sit-down with Darius for the first episode of her new investigative series, Altitudes of Truth Systems, Power in the Passengers Who Challenge Them. She adjusted her microphone, glancing over her notes. "You ready?" she asked as the cameras blinked red. Darius gave a small smile. "Always." Janet began, "Mr. Cole, when you boarded that flight under the alias DOL, did you already suspect what would happen?" "I didn't suspect," he said. "I knew. The data showed us. What I didn't know was just how quickly a single moment could collapse the facade." "What about Mara, Rick, the captain individuals?" Darius said, carefully operating within a system that rewarded silent bias and punished dissent. "Accountability matters, but structural change matters more. And Edward Concade Darius paused. A man who believed systems existed to serve people like him and couldn't see their flaws until they collapsed on him. Janet nodded, her voice lowering, and Linda Park Darius glanced at Linda behind the camera, watching silently. A reminder, he said, that courage doesn't come from titles. It comes from choice, from refusing to accept standard policy when you know it's wrong. The camera held his expression for a beat, then the screen faded to black. In terminals across the country, passengers now saw signage declaring bias-free boarding, policy enforced. New complaint hotlines had been activated. Algorithms were being independently audited. The industry's skeletons were tumbling out. And for once, change didn't feel performative. It felt personal, because one man had taken a seat, and the whole structure had shifted around him. The plane had landed, the cameras had rolled, the crew had been detained. But what happened next was where the real upheaval began. By the time the FAA released its preliminary investigation findings, every senior executive from the airline's customer experience division had either resigned or been placed under federal scrutiny. The board scrambled to appoint an interim ethics committee, cobbling together a mix of in-house counsel, DEI consultants, and PR advisors. But their first meeting collapsed in under 20 minutes. Why? Because the person scheduled to chair the emergency ethics review, nominated just hours prior, was denied clearance by federal investigators. Turns out she was on the original email thread that instructed agents like Mara Jennings to maintain prestige in premium class environments. The policy wasn't even subtle. It referred to customers not by name but by designation. Class A executive class, Class B standard high yield, and Class C watch list potential conflict or profile mismatch. Darius Cole's decoy alias had been placed squarely in Class C. At ColTech, Taylor sat across from Linda in the secure conference room, scrolling through the leaked documents. "This," Taylor muttered, "is worse than we thought." Linda didn't blink, and exactly what we predicted. They had already begun the back-end preparations to expand ColTech's audit protocol from a pilot project into a full-scale industry compliance platform. That meant onboarding law firms, training AI for sector-specific detection, and most significantly, partnering with regulators. Darius wasn't waiting for change to be requested. He was institutionalizing it. But change wasn't only happening from the top. Inside a quiet suburban office near Philadelphia, a young black airline employee named Tyrell had just gotten word of the viral incident involving Darius Cole. He'd worked baggage for years, overlooked for promotion, passed up for leadership training, despite excellent metrics, and yet he still showed up. When the story broke, Tyrell opened his old HR folder and pulled out a complaint he had filed 18 months ago after a supervisor demoted him without explanation. At the time, it was marked resolved, no action taken. Now, with the new hotline activated and whistleblower protections guaranteed by federal order, Tyrell resubmitted his complaint. Within 48 hours, he had a callback. Within 72, he was on the phone with a civil rights attorney, and he wasn't alone. Thousands of employees, former passengers, and internal dissenters began speaking up, some through proper channels, some through Janet Rowe's rapidly expanding investigative platform. Together, their voices created a cascade of truth that even the airline's shareholders couldn't ignore. The airline's market value had already dropped 17% post-incident. Now it was free-falling. Meanwhile, at Meridian Global, the firm at the center of the patent theft scandal, Edward Concade, had gone completely dark. Not a single press release, no public apology, no scheduled appearances. But internally, things were unraveling. Their primary investor, Fenmore Capital, issued a formal request for emergency review of all surveillance products sold under the Concade signature suite. In less than 24 hours, their biggest law enforcement contracts had been frozen pending audit. And at ColTech, Taylor handed Darius a folder. "Meridian just fired half their data ethics team," she said. "They're bleeding talent, and some of that talent is calling us." Darius flipped through the folder, pausing on one name. Ronaldo Esteban, their original ethics chief. He resigned last year, Taylor confirmed. Reported tampering in their internal fairness algorithms. Got pushed out and gagged with an NDA. "Can we get him?" Darius asked. Taylor smiled. He reached out. Said he's been following everything we've built. He wants to help. At the same time, a different kind of reversal was unfolding inside the very airline that had removed Darius from business class. In the newly created Office of Passenger Equity, the only candidate unanimously supported by internal staff was Linda Park. The irony wasn't lost on her. 6 months ago, she was nervously straightening her flight attendant uniform, worried about her probation status and hiding the pain of her brother's incarceration. Now she was sitting at a mahogany table across from the very board members who had approved the biased protocols. Her offer letter was already co-signed by the FAA and ColTech as part of the consent decree. And this time she didn't flinch. Her first request, every current employee with an unresolved discrimination complaint gets reviewed by an independent civilian panel. No exceptions. One of the board members cleared his throat. That would set precedent across the industry. Linda met his gaze. That's the point. They fell silent. Then the chairwoman nodded. Make it happen. Power had shifted, not through a memo, through momentum. Back at ColTech HQ, Darius stood at the overlook window of his top-floor office. Below, the New York skyline buzzed. Digital billboards flashed his face. His quote, "Visibility is not a privilege, it's a right," was everywhere. He turned as Taylor entered. FAA's confirmed, she said. The Inclusive Mobility Initiative is going to be signed next week. They're asking you to testify at the announcement. Darius nodded. Book it. Linda entered behind her, a familiar calm in her stride. Marcus just called. They want him to give a talk at Harvard on algorithmic justice. Darius smiled faintly. Tell him to wear a tie. The three of them stood together for a moment, former strangers, now stewards of a storm that had shifted the balance of accountability. The work wasn't done, but the system had blinked. And for once, it had blinked first. It began not with a press conference or policy shift, but with a silence. For the first time in company history, the airline's weekly leadership call opened with no one speaking. Not the interim CEO, not the head of operations, not even the general counsel. Because across all their screens, one image filled the Zoom grid. It was a still frame pulled from Janet Rowe's latest exposé, Linda Park, kneeling beside a sobbing passenger and coach comforting her, while the rest of the crew ignored her entirely. The overlay read, "Compassion isn't in the policy, it's in the person." A full minute passed before the general counsel finally cleared his throat. "We need to talk about succession." The sentence dropped like a stone. In the days following the FAA's interim sanctions, the airline had been stripped of several key contracts, including a multi-million-dollar federal transportation partnership. Their crisis response playbook, crafted for mechanical failures and price scandals, was useless in the face of a moral implosion. They didn't just need new leadership. They needed new credibility. And there was only one person the public trusted right now, Linda Park. Meanwhile, Linda sat in her modest new office at ColTech's ethics division. A plain plaque on the door read, Director of Integrity Architecture. She still didn't feel like she belonged in this much power. But the files on her desk reminded her exactly why she was here. 74 case reviews, 32 impacted lives pending algorithmic reversal, 9 personal apology letters typed and signed by her. The door creaked open. Taylor entered holding a sealed envelope. "You've been nominated." Linda blinked. "For what?" "To chair the Independent Reform Task Force at the airline," Taylor said, setting the envelope down. "They're dissolving their legacy board and restructuring from the ground up." Linda looked down at the offer, her mind racing. "This isn't symbolic," Taylor continued. "The FAA is requiring it. ColTech gets one seat on the restructured board. Darius said it should be yours." Linda's first instinct was to decline. But then she thought of Marcus, of her mother sitting alone through court hearings, of the supervisor who once told her some passengers don't need an explanation, they need discipline. She looked back at Taylor. "I'll do it." The first meeting of the Reform Task Force took place inside an old conference hall at JFK. Gone were the sleek designer chairs and catered lunches. This was bare bones, folding tables, mismatched mugs, and whiteboards already scuffed with marker. Linda sat at the head, flanked by 2 new appointees, a disability rights advocate and a transportation union rep. No one wore suits. That was deliberate. Their first agenda item, a full passenger equity audit using ColTech's AI. A young analyst named Rena projected a screen onto the wall. "This data set spans 2 years, over 7 million flights. We've color-coded passenger movement, downgrade incidents, complaint escalations." Linda held up a hand. Just show us the patterns. The heat map flooded the wall in waves of red and orange dense clusters where passengers of color were downgraded, flagged, or ignored, far outpacing white counterparts. When compared against purchase price and loyalty status, the disparity deepened. 36% of business class downgrades involved Black or Latino passengers, Rena said softly. They accounted for just 12% of premium ticket holders. The room went silent. No one defended the numbers. Not this time. Linda circled a region on the map near the West Coast routes. Let's start here. I want to see every crew log and incident report tied to these flights. A ripple of resolve moved through the room. This wasn't performative. This was structural. Back at ColTech, Darius Cole stood before a team of new interns, all of whom had been selected through a blind hiring process. No names, no photos, just resumes stripped of identity markers. Look around, he said. You've already disrupted the old system because you got here on merit, not on biased blind familiarity. One intern, a young woman named Aria, raised her hand. Sir, do you think the airline would have changed if you weren't Darius Cole? Darius didn't flinch. No, he said plainly. That's why I became visible. So the invisible could finally be heard. He paused. But here's the real test. Can we build systems so fair that it won't matter who's watching? The room nodded. Not with blind optimism, but with earned conviction. Across town, Janet Rowe was finalizing her next report. Her new media venture, FlightCheck, had just signed a syndication deal with a major news network. But she wasn't writing about ColTech this time. She was digging into 3 other airlines, all flagged by readers who had watched the Darius flight unfold and started asking harder questions of their own. Bias doesn't stop at 30,000 feet, she wrote. It begins there because altitude creates invisibility. And when people think no one's watching, they show you who they really are. Her inbox was flooded with testimonials, each one a data point, each one a potential spark. She smiled as she hit publish. Change had leaders now, and it was gaining altitude. The transformation of the airline didn't begin with speeches, it began with silence. For the first time in its 67-year history, Horizon Airways voluntarily shut down operations on all domestic routes for a full business day. No flights departed, no boarding calls echoed through terminals, no jet engines roared. Just a looping announcement in every airport where Horizon had gates. We are pausing to restructure how we serve you. Not because we were told to, but because we must. It was radical, unprecedented, and orchestrated by the woman who used to pour tomato juice in seat 27B, now seated at the head of the Ethics and Service Renewal Commission. Linda Park stood inside the airline's central command center that morning, watching the live feed of grounded planes and empty terminals. The scale of the pause was staggering. Thousands of passengers rescheduled, millions in revenue forfeited, all for one reason: to make it known that business as usual was over. She turned to her team. Let's begin. The first policy to fall was discretionary seating reassignment, a vague clause that had allowed supervisors like Mara to bump passengers with no oversight. In its place, a new protocol, visibility mapping. Every seat change would now be tracked, audited, and publicly recorded in anonymized form by ColTech's fairness algorithm. Passenger race ticket status and reason codes would be logged in real time, accessible to regulators and watchdog media. From now on, Linda said, no one gets moved without a reason. And reason can't be someone more comfortable walked up. The union pushed back. Crew comfort, they argued. VIP expectations. Safety discretion. Linda listened, then replied calmly, you're not losing control, you're losing unchecked power. And with that, the policy was passed. Next came uniform protocol. At first glance, it had nothing to do with equity, but the committee found that crew with lower grooming scores were more often punished for minor infractions. And grooming, they discovered, was graded through an AI model that penalized natural hairstyles and darker skin tones as unpolished. The old standard was quietly removed. In its place, a mirror check. If your AI system would have flagged Frederick Douglass for his hair, it's time to reprogram. The airline didn't just scrap the algorithm. It licensed ColTech's anti-bias toolkit, becoming the first major carrier to replace vanity standards with values-based appearance equity. Linda watched as the new code deployed live. Small change, huge meaning. By week 3, the airline's entire training division had been rebuilt. Gone were the diversity and inclusion slides with smiling stock photos. Replacing them, live workshops led by passengers who had experienced in-flight discrimination firsthand. They called it the other side of the trade table, a 5-hour immersive session featuring real testimonials, AI-generated reenactments, and role reversal simulations. Flight attendants who once rolled their eyes during bias training now sat in silence watching as Darius Cole's boarding pass flickered on the screen beside graphs of demotion patterns, call, button delays, and seating reassignments. Then Linda stepped forward, holding up a copy of her brother's conviction record. "This isn't just about service," she said. "It's about systems. Because when bias is small enough, everyone thinks it's someone else's fault." Not one trainee left early that day. In the fourth week, the airline formally dismantled its legacy customer profiling algorithm, the one that had predicted risk of non-compliance based on zip code, age, and purchase method. It had been quietly assigning escalation flags to 22% of non-white passengers who booked via mobile apps. Now, with ColTech's oversight, the model was stripped and rebuilt from scratch. No more assumptions, no more labels. Every risk marker required verifiable behavior, no proxies, no bias-hiding shortcuts. The algorithm that once targeted Marcus Park now protected others like him. Linda printed a certificate with his name and pinned it beside her desk, system cleared. Risk level human. Back in the boardroom, something else shifted. For the first time, the majority of the airline's executive leadership included women, people of color, and those with non-traditional career paths. It wasn't a quota, it was math. The company had analyzed its own hiring funnel and realized that they'd lost most diverse candidates at the final stage cultural fit, so they killed the term altogether. If culture means sameness, Linda told the board, then sameness is failure. From now on, interviews were scored not on fit, but on friction. The courage to challenge norms was no longer a red flag, it was the entire point. And then came the new Passenger Bill of Rights, drafted not by executives, but by customers, activists, and industry outsiders. It included the right to clear reasons for reassignment, the right to be addressed by name and not profiled by sight, the right to dignity even at 30,000 feet. Printed in bold font and posted in every aircraft galley, it was more than policy. It was promise. One line stood out: "You are not your seat. You are your story." Darius, reviewing the document from his office, smiled. Systems were evolving, and for the first time, those inside the machine were building it with conscience. When the news broke that Horizon Airways had grounded itself for an entire day to address systemic bias, most Americans didn't know what to make of it. Airports were silent. Flights were canceled. And yet, instead of outrage, a different mood crept into the national conversation, one of startled curiosity. Talk shows debated it. Morning anchors marveled at it. And passengers, people who had been told they were imagining things for years, began to speak up. One of the first viral videos came from a retired teacher in Atlanta. Her phone footage showed a flight attendant telling her to just wait until others are seated after she had paid for early boarding. "Now I see," she said into the camera, her voice trembling. "I wasn't just being oversensitive. I was being silently dismissed. For years." By noon, the hashtag #SeatWithRespect had flooded timelines. By evening, it was trending worldwide. People weren't just reacting, they were remembering. The sideways glances, the seat changes with no explanation, the call buttons ignored, the way priority always seemed to mean someone else. It wasn't a protest, it was a reckoning. Janet Rowe's independent newsroom flight check had been tracking every thread. Within 72 hours of the Horizon shutdown, her team compiled over 200 first-hand accounts of perceived racial or class-based discrimination across U.S. airlines. That number doubled by the end of the week. Their interactive map, the Bias Flight Path, let users click any major airport and read real stories submitted by travelers. Told I didn't qualify for an upgrade. Then watched 2 white teenagers get bumped up for free. Asked 3 times if I belonged in first class despite having a boarding pass in my hand. Crew assumed I didn't speak English, gave my safety instructions to the white guy next to me. Each pin was a spark, each story ignited memory in someone else, and slowly the fire spread. Airlines scrambled. Executives across the industry, long insulated by layers of customer service departments and legal buffers, were suddenly facing the court of public opinion. And this time the court had receipts. In response, three major carriers held emergency press conferences within 48 hours of each other. Each vowed to reassess internal protocols and deepen their commitment to equitable treatment. But it wasn't enough. The public didn't want PR. They wanted transparency. So when Horizon published its internal seating bias data complete with anonymized boarding trends, seating reassignments by race and complaint patterns, the internet exploded. They actually did it. First airline in history to publish proof of its own failure. This is what accountability looks like. Other companies took notice. Fast. The airline's bold reforms, spearheaded by Linda Park and Darius Cole, sparked a ripple effect far beyond the tarmac. Public schools requested copies of Horizon's ethics training modules. Hospital administrators began reevaluating their patient triage algorithms. Even national retailers, long plagued by accusations of customer profiling, quietly inquired about licensing ColTech's fairness detection system. What began with a boarding pass was now reshaping entire sectors. But the most powerful shift was emotional. People were finally connecting the dots between small slights in larger systems. The father who had always been asked to show ID twice. The student pulled out of line for random screening. The mother told her airline miles had expired while watching others redeem theirs freely. Bias, once invisible, was now illuminated, and it stung. In living rooms across America, families gathered to watch a Sunday evening interview with Darius Cole on 60 Minutes. He wasn't a celebrity in the traditional sense. No tabloid rumors, no glossy magazine covers. Just a calm, soft-spoken, black man in a tailored charcoal blazer sitting across from veteran journalist Gail Hampton, answering every question with clarity and care. Mr. Cole, she asked, why subject yourself to humiliation when you could have exposed this issue from the top? His answer was simple. Because systems don't change from being told they're broken. They change when they're forced to confront the pain they have caused. He paused, and that pain is easier to ignore when it's abstract, but not when it sits in 27B. The country listened, not just to his words, but to the spaces between them, the restraint, the discipline. The choice to endure the very thing he was trying to dismantle just to prove it still existed. That night, social media overflowed with a single phrase, I believe you now. In churches, barbershops, classrooms, and corporate retreats, the conversation evolved. Bias wasn't just about intent. It was about impact. It wasn't about bad people. It was about unchecked patterns. And dignity, people began to realize, wasn't a perk you earned with points or paychecks. It was a human right. Darius, watching quietly from his ColTech office in Manhattan, understood the moment's weight. This wasn't vindication, it was validation. The public had awakened not just to Horizon's misconduct, but to a truth that had long hovered in silence above every flight path, that justice must be engineered. And that sometimes the most powerful protest doesn't come from shouting, but from sitting still in a seat you were told you didn't deserve. It started with Delta. 3 days after Horizon's full transparency release, Delta Airlines announced the launch of an independent internal audit. Not just a review of their flight procedures, but a top-down forensic investigation into every algorithm, employee protocol, and customer complaint system currently in use. Then came American Airlines, followed by United, then Southwest, then JetBlue. Within a week, every major U.S. carrier had issued public commitments to review potential bias in their seating assignments, upgrade policies, and customer service protocols. Not one of them had planned to. But Horizon's data dump had forced an industry-wide reckoning. Public pressure had become impossible to ignore. But the ripple didn't stop at aviation. 2 days after Delta's press release, Bankwell, a multinational financial services company, issued a surprise announcement. They were suspending their AI-based loan approval system. An internal review triggered by similarities in ColTech's report had revealed that their software had been disproportionately flagging applications from Black and Latino neighborhoods as high risk even when income and debt ratios were identical to white applicants. The scandal broke overnight. Screenshots leaked by a whistleblower showed internal memos. Optics matter. Use area credit density as the explanation, not race. Bankwell's CEO issued an apology. But by morning, 3 competing institutions had preemptively paused their own AI-based underwriting systems for fear of exposure. Darius Cole hadn't just lit a match under the airline industry. He'd set the entire algorithmic infrastructure of American commerce on fire. Back at ColTech, the Ethics and Accountability Division, once a quiet back-office research unit, had become the company's new flagship. Linda Park, now leading a team of 140 engineers, data scientists, and civil rights analysts, found herself flooded with requests, not just from tech companies, but from healthcare providers, school boards, even military contractors. Everyone wanted one thing: an inclusion audit. We're living in an era where bias is no longer a whisper, she explained during a roundtable on NPR. It's embedded in the code. And now we have to learn how to debug our culture. The quote was clipped and shared across platforms. Debug our culture trended for 48 hours straight. The phrase resonated because it didn't point fingers. It offered a fix. Janet Rowe's journalism was now at the center of the storm. Her blog Flight Check, once a niche hub for airline accountability, had transformed into a full media platform. She and her team now ran 3 separate editorial tracks: bias in travel, bias in finance, bias in automation. One of their exposés revealed that a popular rideshare app had quietly deprioritized driver requests from non-white neighborhoods after 10 p.m., a measure claimed to optimize driver safety. The pattern had gone unnoticed for years, until ColTech's audit framework picked it up. The public response was swift. Lawsuits were filed, boycotts were organized. The app's valuation fell 18% in a week. Janet's reputation grew, but so did the stakes. Her team received death threats. Major corporations sent cease and desist letters. Anonymous sources begged to come forward, fearing retaliation. What had begun on a plane had now become a movement. And not everyone wanted that movement to continue. In Washington, D.C., the implications were impossible to ignore. Senator Naomi Bledsoe of Massachusetts, long known for her advocacy on civil rights and technology regulation, proposed new legislation, the Algorithmic Fairness in Commerce Act, AFCO. The bill would require any consumer-facing AI used in hiring, lending, public benefits, or transportation to undergo independent bias testing before deployment. It's no longer acceptable to say the computer decided, Bledsoe said on the Senate floor, because those computers were programmed by people, and people carry bias. The bill gained bipartisan traction, a rare alignment of progressive civil rights advocates and conservative privacy hawks. A Senate hearing was called, and Darius Cole was invited to testify. Inside ColTech's Manhattan headquarters, Darius reviewed the invitation silently. He was no stranger to public speaking. His TED Talks, boardroom summits, and conference keynotes had been viewed millions of times. But this felt different. This wasn't a panel. It was a pivot point, a chance to shape the legal future of fairness itself. "I'll do it," he said quietly, handing the invitation back to Taylor. She nodded, understanding the gravity of the moment. "Should we prepare a draft?" "No," he said. "Not yet." He walked to the window overlooking the city. Below, the streets buzzed with life, unaware of the tectonic shift happening beneath their feet. People hailing cabs, buying groceries, getting on planes, trains, buses, all of them trusting systems they didn't know were broken. Yet, that evening, Linda received a call from a mid-sized regional airline, Blue Sky Aviation. The CEO, a Korean-American former pilot named Dan Choi, didn't want an audit. He wanted a partnership. "I don't want to fix bias when it breaks us," he said. "I want to prevent it before it even forms. What would it take for ColTech to help us build a zero-bias airline from scratch?" Linda blinked. No one had asked that before. She asked for a day to think. Then she called Darius. "Are we ready to build something better?" she asked. Darius smiled. "We were always ready. They just weren't listening before." Now they were, from airports to banks, from boardrooms to Congress. The echoes of that one flight where a man lost his seat but held his ground were reshaping every corner of society. The systems had been cracked open, and now they could finally be rebuilt. The Capitol Rotunda buzzed with tension. Under the dome where Abraham Lincoln once lay in state, and Martin Luther King Jr.'s bust now stood quietly at the edge of history. Darius Cole took a deep breath, then another. The Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Technology, Privacy, and Civil Rights was in full session. Rows of senators' aides, cameras, and reporters lined the chamber. To the left sat corporate lobbyists in polished suits, representatives from Meridian global legacy banks, insurance conglomerates, and transportation unions. To the right sat civil rights leaders, ethics professors, and victims of algorithmic injustice. At the center, under oath and without notes, stood Darius Cole. His hands rested on the table in front of him, not clenched, not fidgeting, but open, intentional, receptive. Mr. Cole, began Senator Bledsoe, her tone firm but respectful. You claim your company has uncovered systemic racial and class bias in the algorithms that run our daily lives, in loan approvals and airline upgrades and facial recognition systems. Why should the American people believe Darius didn't flinch? He met her gaze calmly. Because the evidence speaks louder than I ever could. He paused, then added, we didn't hack these systems. We didn't manipulate the results. We simply recorded what they already do when no one's watching. He pressed a button on a small remote. Behind him on the congressional monitor, a series of split-screen videos began to play. One side, white passengers receiving upgrades, assistance, and warm greetings. The other side, passengers of color denied service, downgraded, ignored. Another clip, a bank's algorithm denying identical loan applications approved only when names like Emily and Jake replaced Jamal and Lakeisha. A final clip, Linda Parks had hidden footage from the plane capturing the exact moment flight supervisor Mara Jennings said, he looks like trouble anyway. Best to keep an eye on those types. The room fell silent. The monitor froze on the still frame of Mara's face, smug, unaware, caught mid-whisper. Then the data overlay appeared, ColTech AI Predictive Model 89. 3% probability of racial bias behavior in passenger reassignment. Source flight HC4228. Timestamp 11:02 a.m. Cross-validated with 5 years of seating data. Senator Bledsoe leaned forward. Is that real-time analysis? Darius nodded. Our ethical AI doesn't just detect bias, it contextualizes it. In the same way your car alerts you to a drifting lane, our system alerts companies to drifting ethics. A conservative Senator Green from South Dakota cut in skeptical. But isn't this just surveillance in another form? You're watching everything. Isn't that a privacy nightmare? Darius didn't dodge. The difference is intention, he said. We don't watch people, we watch systems. The people are already being watched by algorithms they don't control. We're just turning the lens back around. Green frowned but didn't interrupt again. Bledsoe tapped her gavel softly. Mr. Cole, can you walk us through what happened on flight HC4228? And so he did. Calmly, thoroughly, without dramatics. He told them how he purchased the ticket under a decoy profile flagged by ColTech's bias probability model. How he was downgraded when Edward Kincaid, a white executive with connections to Meridian Global, demanded his seat. How the flight crew dismissed his requests. How Linda Park quietly documented it all. How Janet Rowe captured every biased interaction. How his team rerouted all outbound communications from the plane to ensure evidence couldn't be scrubbed. The senators listened closely, so did the cameras. By the time he finished, even the lobbyists had stopped whispering among themselves. That night, every major network led with the story. Cole testifies. The algorithmic reckoning blared across CNN. Airline bias goes to Washington ran across the AP wire. On TikTok, a clip of Darius saying people reveal who they are when they think you're beneath them was remixed over dozens of trending tracks. The youth had adopted it as a rallying phrase. By midnight, the subcommittee issued a bipartisan resolution recommending passage of the AFCA, the Algorithmic Fairness in Commerce Act. It wasn't law yet, but it was coming. Back at ColTech, Janet met with Linda over tea in the company's rooftop cafe. You realize we're in the middle of history, Janet asked, scanning a new batch of anonymous testimonies pouring into her encrypted inbox. Linda didn't smile. We're not in the middle. We're at the beginning. The exposure was only step one. She tapped the screen and flipped it around. An email from a major hospital chain, subject disparities in diagnostic AI outcomes message. We think we found bias in how our system prioritizes cardiac care. Can your team help? Janet exhaled. Healthcare now. Linda nodded. Transportation, banking, insurance, hiring, education, now medicine. Janet looked out at the skyline. Do you think it ever ends? No, Linda said simply, but maybe one day it balances. In his office, Darius stood by the same window where he had once stared out after the flight, before the hearings, before the trend lines, before the shift. Taylor entered with a folder. The Justice Department is opening a full investigation into Meridian Global, antitrust, civil rights, and ethics violations. And Edward Darius asked. Still trying to play both sides, Taylor said. But he's cooperating. For now. Darius looked out again. The world was shifting. And soon it would fall into full view. The final exposure had begun. 3 days after Darius's testimony shook Capitol Hill, the streets outside ColTech headquarters were oddly still. No protesters, no media vans, no camera drones buzzing overhead. Just the hum of everyday life resuming, buses sighing at stops, coffee carts steaming under the chill morning sun, and the occasional click of heels on pavement. But inside the building, something was shifting. Not loud, not dramatic. Just deep. In the ethics division on the 27th floor, Linda Park stood before a digital display showing hundreds of algorithmic red flags submitted by partner institutions hiring models that quietly rejected applicants from certain zip codes, insurance formulas that rated Latino families at higher risk, despite identical profiles. College application screeners that deprioritized ethnic-sounding names. And among them all, one line blinked green. Case JR7745, Marcus Park. Reversal confirmed. She exhaled sharply, not realizing she'd been holding her breath. Behind her, Darius entered quietly. He's free, she said, voice tight with emotion. I saw, Darius replied, nodding to the screen. I read the ruling. Judge called it a miscarriage of justice amplified by technological negligence. That phrase is going to appear in law textbooks for the next 50 years. Linda smiled faintly, but the weight in her eyes lingered. I keep thinking about the people who won't get this chance. The ones still buried under biased data. We're not done, Darius said. But today we mark this one. We mark it for what it is. She turned toward him, which is victory. In a quiet courthouse downtown, Marcus Park walked into the sun. No handcuffs, no ankle monitor, no parole officer trailing behind. Just his sister waiting at the curb holding his medical school acceptance letter in one hand and a thermos of the herbal tea their mother used to make in the other. Ready? She asked. Marcus didn't speak, just nodded, overwhelmed. He looked up at the sky, blinking against the light, then stepped forward. That single stride was heavier than any sentence the state had ever imposed. Back at ColTech, the company cafeteria was hosting a small private gathering. No press, no fanfare, just 50 employees who had worked day and night through the fallout of the airline exposure, sitting at round tables with mismatched mugs and half-eaten bagels. Janet Rose stood at the center. For those of you who don't know, she began, I didn't plan to be a reporter again. I was burned out. Freelancing. Doing tech PR ghostwriting to pay rent. She paused. Then I got on a flight to London. Laughter rippled across the room. And I watched what many of you predicted would happen exactly as predicted, only I saw it and recorded it. And when I posted about it, something cracked open. Not because I had a better camera or a louder voice, but because the moment finally came when enough people were ready to believe the truth. She lifted her mug to quiet victories, the ones that don't trend. The ones that rewrite policies, not just headlines. Glasses clinked. Linda raised hers too, to people who watch when no one else does. Darius from the back of the room simply nodded. Later that night in his home office overlooking the East River, Darius reviewed the final data set for Observation Protocol 12. All variables accounted for, all events time-stamped, a full narrative of bias resistance documentation and accountability wrapped inside a flight manifest and unrolled across an industry. He closed the file, encrypted it, archived it. Then he opened a different tab. Subject Linda Park, Executive Track Message, recommend immediate promotion to Vice President of Algorithmic Justice. Notes, proven judgment under pressure. Unique capacity to see both systems and people. Not just a survivor of the system, a designer of better ones. He hit send. A few seconds later, Taylor pinged him from the next room. Drafts ready for tomorrow's industry summit. Want to preview? Let it sit tonight, he replied. The system we're building isn't fragile anymore. It can hold for a day. She sent back a thumbs up emoji. For once, that felt right. Elsewhere in a dim hospital corridor, Edward Consincade watched a late-night news broadcast on his phone. ColTech's ethical AI programs have now been adopted by 3 major airlines. In a statement today, the Department of Transportation cited unprecedented data transparency and equity outcomes as justification for an executive order mandating annual bias audits for all federal transportation contractors. He looked tired, older, but his eyes didn't flinch. Beside him sat a folder marked Meridian Global Internal Memo, Ethical Reconstruction Initiative. He didn't open it. Not yet. He simply muttered, "This time we start right." No one was around to hear him, but maybe that was the point. Quiet victory didn't mean soft. It meant strategic, measured, patient. It meant knowing the difference between noise and change and choosing the one that endured. In a world obsessed with going viral, this team had chosen something else. Systemic shift. It didn't scream. It didn't announce itself. But it moved mountains in silence. And in the quiet, justice was beginning to speak fluently. 6 months later, the legacy of that single flight had taken root in ways no one had expected. In Washington, a bipartisan bill titled the Algorithmic Fairness and Accountability Act passed its final Senate vote with a surprising margin. The legislation mandated bias audits for all public-facing algorithms used by government contractors, including airlines, banks, employment platforms, and surveillance systems. It was the first federal law of its kind. The bill had a face: Darius Cole. But behind his name stood a coalition of journalists like Janet Rowe, former flight attendants like Linda Park, wrongfully convicted men like Marcus Park, and thousands of silent passengers who had endured quiet indignities without headlines. The legacy wasn't a statue, it was infrastructure. In ColTech's newly opened Algorithmic Justice Center, walls were lined not with awards, but with real-time data maps showing bias incidents caught and corrected in systems from New York to Nairobi. These weren't just color-coded heat maps. They were living records of a new standard being forged. Linda stood before one, tracking a blue ripple in South Carolina. A school district's scholarship recommendation AI had flagged minority applicants as less likely to persist based on coded language in teacher reviews. The alert had been caught within hours. Policy updated. The school board issued a public apology, and retraining began the same week. "We stopped it before it cost someone their future," Linda said aloud to no one. That was the work now. Quiet, precise, preventative. She turned to see Marcus entering the observation bay in his lab coat. Not a guest, a resident researcher. Back on track. "They fixed the data flag," he asked. They did. Reweighed persistence variables based on attendance and academic curiosity instead of subjective evaluations. He smiled. "Smart. We're starting to teach that framework at my school now. Data integrity and ethical AI design as core medical competencies." Linda raised an eyebrow. "Doctors learning code, not code. Patterns. Bias is a diagnostic now, and we're learning how to treat it." Across town, Janet Rowe sat in a modest glass office inside the new Flight Check newsroom, a media lab dedicated entirely to investigating algorithmic bias in public services. It had grown from her original blog into a fully funded independent watchdog with reporters on 5 continents. Today's headline: Insurance Algorithm Denies Care Based on Zip Code. We Follow the Money Trail. The story had already triggered a congressional inquiry. She glanced at her next assignment, a multi-part investigation into how certain AI-powered resume filters were systematically eliminating applicants from HBCUs and community colleges. A knock at her door. "Taylor, I'm supposed to tell you Darius is 5 minutes out." Janet nodded. "He's still doing the museum thing every year," Taylor said. "Even got them to move the boarding pass plaque to a more prominent spot." "Good. Hey, did you hear?" Taylor added. "The airline new CEO just fired another 5 execs, internal shakeup, full name change going live next month." Janet leaned back, smiling. "History's moving." Taylor replied, "And we're writing it in real time." At the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, the grand auditorium buzzed with energy, not because of Darius Cole, but because of the 100 teenage scholars seated in the front rows. The inaugural Cole Fellowship class chosen not by GPA or test scores, but by one shared attribute. They had all at some point been flagged downgraded or excluded by a biased system, and now they were being trained to fix it. Darius stepped onto the stage without notes, no teleprompter, just memory and conviction. "When I was 16, he began, I built a janky little program that predicted whether I'd get stopped by security based on the neighborhood I was in and the hoodie I was wearing." Polite chuckles from the students. Recognition. "Back then I thought I was gaming the system. Now I understand I was mapping it. He paused. You can't change a system you don't understand. But once you see the patterns, you get a choice. He turned to the students. You can conform, or you can challenge it, fix it, rebuild it from the inside out. That's what this fellowship is about, giving you the tools not just to survive the algorithm, but to rewrite it. The applause that followed wasn't thunderous. It was resonant, grounded. Outside, as the event wound down, Darius found himself alone at the exhibit that had sparked it all, the framed boarding pass. Below it, a new bronze plaque had been added. This flight redefined direction. Not just where we travel, but how we treat each other along the way. A janitor paused near him, pushing a mop bucket. You, Mr. Cole, the man asked. I am. The janitor wiped a hand on his apron and extended it. Thank you. For what? Darius asked, genuinely curious. My daughter. They told her she wasn't the right fit. Then your story hit. 3 weeks later, she was in orientation. First black woman hired in the customer relations division in years. Darius shook his hand. Glad she's in. She's not just in, the man said. She's head of the new passenger equity review team, making sure what happened to you never happens again. Darius watched the man walk away. That was legacy. Not fame, not control, but impact without proximity, the kind of change that didn't require your presence to continue. As the museum lights dimmed and the exhibit cases locked for the night, Darius turned from the plaque and walked toward the future. And it was already better. The sun rose over New York City with a clarity that seemed symbolic. Crisp beams of light spilled between skyscrapers, bouncing off windows, casting long shadows that slowly dissolved as the day began. Inside the newly established headquarters of the Coalition for Algorithmic Equity, Darius Cole stood before a bank of monitors displaying real-time metrics from around the globe, hiring practices at Fortune 500 companies, medical treatment algorithms at major hospitals, even school admission patterns, all now monitored by independent systems born from the seed planted on Flight 1739. The middle seat in row 27B had become legend, but Darius hadn't come to marvel at the numbers today. He was here for something quieter, something more enduring. At the far end of the corridor, a private meeting room had been set for one-purpose transition. Linda Park entered first, now visibly comfortable in her role as ColTech's Director of Ethics and Accountability. Gone were the anxieties that once clung to her uniform. Her posture now carried the weight of experience and the steadiness of someone who had stood her ground and kept standing. Across the room, Marcus Park waited. Recently accepted into Harvard Medical School, he'd deferred a year to continue his work at ColTech's Injustice Lab. His was a name now whispered in academic circles, someone who had walked through the fire of systemic bias and returned not burned but brilliant. Janet Rowe joined them next, fresh from a segment on 60 Minutes. Her exposé series had sparked investigations across 5 industries, and yet she still insisted on reporting at eye level, no pedestal, no pretense. Taylor Darius's lifelong operations chief gave him a nod from the doorway. They're ready. He stepped into the room. Today he began, we stop reacting and start reimagining. The meeting wasn't a celebration, it was strategy. Across the table were representatives from industries that had once resisted scrutiny, airlines, banks, hospitals, universities. Not one of them had come willingly. They were summoned by public demand and measurable impact. But they came, and that was new. Darius clicked a remote. A slide appeared on the screen, a composite image of a boarding pass, a police mugshot, a rejected loan application, and a denied resume, each representing someone excluded, downgraded, or dismissed by flawed systems. These, he said quietly, are the gatekeepers of yesterday. He clicked again. New images, scholarship letters, job offers, reinstated convictions, algorithm logs, with bias alerts flagged and corrected in real time. And these, he continued, are what justice looks like when it's baked into the system, not just preached on a podium. Then he turned to them. You are not here for optics. You are here because the public won't tolerate plausible deniability anymore. Not when the data speaks. Not when the stories are this clear. The question is no longer whether you'll change, but whether you'll help lead the change or be left behind. Silence. Then one executive, the CEO of a major airline, spoke up. What exactly are you proposing? For Cole. Darius smiled faintly. a full compliance framework, independent bias audits, real consequences, and a public dashboard that shows the world whether you're getting better or hiding behind silence. There were murmurs of discomfort, but no one left, because they knew. 6 months ago, this would have sounded like overreach. Now it was inevitable. That evening, Darius returned to the museum, not for meetings, not for speeches, just to walk the now famous exhibit on Flight 1739, the Turning Point. It had been expanded. New additions included a replica of Janet's original recorder app interface, a flight log signed by Linda Park as the whistleblower, and Marcus Park's prison release form highlighting the line conviction vacated due to systemic algorithmic bias. A group of teenagers walked through behind him, led by a civics teacher. One student asked, "Did he know it would work?" The teacher replied, "He knew it might not, but he knew he had to try." Darius lingered behind them, reflecting on the early skepticism he'd faced even from allies. "You'll just make people defensive. Companies will bury it. Too radical, too confrontational." But the truth had pierced through, because he hadn't shouted, he had shown. The images, the data, the stories, and the silence between them. That was where transformation had bloomed. Outside the museum, under the deep violet sky, Darius paused one last time. A text buzzed on his phone. From Taylor. "Congress just introduced the Equitable AI Act. Your TED Talk's trending again." The dominoes are still falling. He looked up at the stars as a plane passed overhead, just another flight, carrying just another set of lives shaped by invisible rules, invisible behavior. But things were changing. Now passengers asked questions. Now employees filmed what they saw. Now executives feared silence more than exposure. That was the legacy. Not fame, not a name etched in stone, but the knowledge that systems could be redesigned. That bias could be confronted not by shouting it down, but by proving it existed. Visibly, undeniably, humanely. And the ripple effects just beginning. If you found this story powerful, subscribe to Real Life Stories New for more narratives that expose injustice and celebrate quiet revolutions. Share this video, comment your thoughts, and never forget, silence enables systems, but courage rewrites them.